Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be talking about JavaScript, which is the third part of the front-end development. So we started by talking about HTML, which is kind of the content that's on our webpage, and then we went into CSS, which is the style of our webpage, and finally we're going to talk about JavaScript here, which is kind of the interaction, the dynamicness of the front-end development process. At the end of the last video, we have this page that we wrote called boots.html. At the very bottom, we have this registration page, and this is probably the first thing that I want to start with, is talk about how we do input-output for JavaScript. Probably the easiest way to do input to JavaScript is through these text boxes and through these various inputs that we can put in our HTML file. So here you see we have a text box, we have a color input, we have some data, we have a data list, and also we have the submit button. All of these things allow us to be able to interact with our web page. Now, currently, when we hit submit, we are actually sending it to a back-end endpoint called process. And right now, we don't really want to talk about the backend, although that's what I want you to realize. That is the default of what is happening. So when I click this submit button, you see that my server is running. It tries to send all of this data that's in the form to this process endpoint. Right now, this process endpoint currently doesn't exist because we didn't write it yet. And we're going to write it a little bit later in another video. But for now, we should note that that is what it's trying to do. So instead of doing this, I'm going to get rid of both of these things. And we're going to add these back in a little bit later on in another video. But for now, I want to prevent it from sending it to the back end. And also, I need to add something into JavaScript in order to prevent that from happening. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So as I said, the first thing we need to do is talk about how we do input into JavaScript. So this text box is one way that we can do it. Another way that we can provide input into JavaScript is through a window prompt. So let's first start by linking a script file. And the way that we link the script file is we use a tag called script. And script, typically we will put it into the head, although the script tag can actually go anywhere in the body. So there are schools of thought where people would say scripts should always go at the end of the body, so you can always write the script at the end, right before the body ends. And the good thing about that is because you will have your whole HTML rendered before you run the script, and that is usually to an advantage. But I'm going to put it here, and I'm going to have a source linked to the script, and I'm going to, in my static folder, create a folder called JS, and inside that JS folder, I'm going to create a new file called script.js, and this is the file that I'm going to link from the boots.html file. So here, if you remember how we do this, we go to the JS folder, and then we go to script.js. And this is now going to link this HTML file to the script. Now, if you remember what I said earlier, I said typically the good thing is to have the script run after all of this HTML is defined, because if we put it at the beginning of our file, we run into the problem of not knowing what the DOM looks like, what the hierarchy looks like before the script is run. So often we write defer to say that, okay, I'm going to run this script, but I want you to run this script after you have everything set up, this whole hierarchy in the HTML set up. And you're going to see why that is in 1 second. So this is how we're going to link this script over to script.js. And now in script.js, we can start to do anything that's programmable, anything that we need to calculate, or any business logic that is associated with the front end. So I'm going to start with doing the inputs. So the first thing we'll do is I'm going to create a var. So a var is just a variable, and I'm going to call it n. There is a window.prompt. So remember I said this is one other way that we can get information into JavaScript. So the first one is the prompt. So I'm going to ask the user's name, and then there's a second parameter that gives a default. So maybe I'll say the default is Bobby. Not really the best default, but this is my window prompt. And so this thing is going to run, and let's say after I get n, maybe I need to process it somehow, and let's say in our case, we're just going to provide an alert. An alert is one way that we can output something to the window. So I'm just going to alert. I'm just going to say hello, and then n. Okay, so I'm just going to say hello, and then this person's name. All right, so just to show you what that sequence looks like, I'm going to refresh the page, and here it's going to give me the prompt, and it's going to give me the default. I'm going to type in some name, and it's going to respond by giving me an alert that says hello, and then the name that I posted. Now, I would say that this is, again, one way that we can get input and output from our web page, but this is probably not the best, right? So typically you wouldn't think of a web page by giving window prompts and window alerts. There's very few of those, and that's because there are better ways to do this. So again, I would probably recommend doing text box, and in terms of giving feedback or giving alerts back to the client, one way we can do that is we can overwrite certain elements that are in the DOM. So I'll show you how to do that in 1 second. But just while we're here, another way that we can provide output to the user is through this console. So if we do inspect, I'm using Chrome here. So if I do inspect, I will have a tab called console, and I can go to the console. And instead of doing a window alert, I can instead do a console.log. Okay, now console.log just means at the console, I want you to log this string. Okay, so now if we refresh this page and I type in my name, instead of giving me an alert, it'll just print it out on the console. And the console is a really good tool, especially when you're developing. You just want to set some flags and you want to check what's going on. You want to check some outputs, check what the certain variables are at certain points in time. This is a very helpful tool just to do a console log. So it's like kind of like a print statement that is kind of not intrusive in the web page. All right, so the next thing we can talk about are the basic constructs of this language. So I'm assuming here that you know the basic constructs of programming. So we have if statements, we have loops, we have arrays that we can work with. So just very quickly give you an example of a for loop. So this is a basic for loop that you probably have encountered in other languages already. So if we do a var I equals 0 and I say I is less than 10, I'm basically doing, so I++, I'm basically cycling through a variable called I, and I'm incrementing I each time, and I'm running it all the way up to 9. When it reaches 10, that's when this for loop is going to end. And we can again do a console.log of I, and we're going to be able to see what that looks like. So again, if we run this file, we'll see that it says hello Bobby, and then it says all of the it will console log all of the numbers from 0 up to 9. Okay, so now we will come back to this file. Okay, but instead of typing something into the file every time, what we can do is using this console, we can actually directly interact with our web page just by typing in some commands into this console. So this console is very much like an interpreter, and it will respond to any command that you type in, so that we can just try out these commands, and if it works, we can then transfer it over to our JS file. So let's talk a little bit about arrays. So for example, I can say var a is equal to new array, and this is one way that we can create an array. We can also say var a is equal to this. Okay, so both of those act in the same way. Now we can check what a is. A currently is an empty array. And now I can put things into the array, and the array is a very important tool in JavaScript, because oftentimes what we have is a lot of data that's coming in. We have to somehow organize them in some structure. So if I do an a.push, I'm going to be able to push certain items into the array. So right now, let's say I'm only working with numbers. So let's say I'm just going to push 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in there. And what this does is it's going to create an array, or actually push these numbers into the array, and in fact it appends each number into the array one at a time. And the good thing about the console is that we can actually open it up and we can evaluate what each of these items are. And this tool is actually going to be very important later on when we actually have, let's say, an array of objects or array of other things that we need to go through and evaluate. So just a few more things about arrays. So what I can do is I can do a var and a var x, and I can do an a dot. We'll do an a dot pop first. Okay, so what a pop does is, if you take a look at what x is, it will take from the end of this array and it's going to put it into the variable x. So if we wanted to process an item in an array, we can remove it. So notice that 5 is actually removed from pop, and it will be assigned to x, and now we can work with x. Okay. Similarly, we can do a concatenation. So for example, if we had a b that is equal to, let's say, 5, 6, 7, and this is another way that we can create a list, I can do an a.concat with b, and this is going to result in a new list. Obviously, this needs to be assigned to something for me to be able to use it. So I can say, let's say var c is equal to this concatenation. I can also do, so let's actually do that. So I will do var c is equal to this. And then now we can see that c is actually 1 through 7. Okay, so from here, we can take a look at a slice command. So a slice, when we do a slice, we're going to be able to slice from a position, a starting position, to an ending position. So if you see that if I slice 1 to 3, I'm going to slice position 1 up to position 3. Now, all of these, hopefully you've seen in past languages before, so I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. Similarly, we can do something like c.shift, and shift is actually the opposite of pop. So if we do a var y c shift, you'll see that y is equal to 1 and c now is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we removed from the front. Okay, so shift and pop are actually the same operation from different ends of the array. All right, so another thing that I want to talk about here, and for this one, I'm just going to go back to our script. I'm just going to comment these out for now. Ways that we can do objects. Represent objects in JavaScript, and one of the most important things in JavaScript are objects, and in fact everything that we talk about in JavaScript are objects, right? When we talk about arrays, when we talk about individual numbers or strings, they are all represented internally in JavaScript as objects. And how objects work is actually pretty simple. Objects are found in a form called JSON. Okay, so it's found in a JSON form, and JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, so JavaScript Object Notation basically has the notation that we begin and end with curly brackets, and inside we simply have value index and value pairs. Property and value pairs. So for example, I can say I have a name, and this name is Bobby. Okay? And they are separated, these property and value pairs are separated by commas. So for example, I can have age, which is a number. Okay, I can have email, which is a string. So let's say C. And I can have other things. I can have nested objects as well. So for example, I can say address, and this address can also be an object. And let's say this address has a number. Right? And we have a number, which is 1, 2, 3, and then I can have a street. So notice that these are properties, right? So fake street, and you can imagine other things as well. All right, so I'm going to assign this as person, and now this is an object that is a person. All right, so once again, we can see the notation is that we have properties and value pairs, and these values can also be objects, and objects can be nested many, many levels. And we're going to start to see that once we go back to the console. All right, so our object can be created, and now we can work with this object however we want. Now, the good thing about objects is that they can be created dynamically, and we can actually add properties dynamically as well, and we can work with the objects dynamically. So as an example, if I refresh this page, if I take a look at what person is, right? Person is this object that I've just created, right? But in addition to this, I can actually add another attribute to person. So if I said person dot, and let's say this person has a password, right? So I can add a password attribute to this person by just assigning whatever, right? So I can just assign this. And now we can see that if we take a look at what person is, person now has a password attribute as well. So we can actually dynamically add properties to these objects that we create. Now, similarly, we can create objects as we go as well. So for example, I can do an a var, and then my object, and then I can make my object equal to just creating a new object. Okay, so if I create a new object, this means that I've created just this squiggly bracket, right? So which is empty currently. And again, I can do my object, and I can keep adding different things to it. So I can say name is equal to, and then we'll say Steve. And now my object has the name and value of Steve. And so you could probably see the usefulness of something like this, like usefulness of this tool. Allows us to be able to dynamically work with objects, and then to be able to add things and work with it dynamically as well. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about in JavaScript are functions. So for a function, it is kept internally as an object. So think of a function as really nothing more than an object. So a function has a notation that we start with function, and we name whatever this function is. So we can call it myfunc, and in the my function, we're going to do whatever we want, and we can give a list of things to do in myfunc. So here, let's just do something simple. We'll do a console.log, and we'll just say hello world. And we can also do a console.log, maybe a variable a. Now, just while we're here, I should mention that inside a function, there is a function scope. So when I do var a is equal to 9, this variable is available to this scope. Okay, so the function actually takes on the scope that is outside of that function as well. Okay, so anything from the outside, any variable that we declare outside of this function is also available in here. So when we call myfunc, for example, right, we will be able to see. And we will be able to see that we're going to console log this number 9. Okay, so and we're also going to console log hello world. So when we call this function, we're going to do both of these things. Now, similarly, I can actually put myfunc up here. Okay, we can call this function before we actually declare it, and this is an idea called hoisting. So functions that we declare in this form can be hoisted, meaning that the functions, meaning that JavaScript is going to read through, basically take a look at all the functions, and it's going to define those definitions at the top of our page. So you can imagine that before we run any of this script, all of those functions that we create in this way are going to be existent. Okay, now there's one exception to this, which is if we create a function and we create it using a var. So another way that we can create a function is I can create a function in this way. I can say myfunc2 is equal to function, and I can declare a function this way. And I can say console.log, and then I'm going to say, well, just do hello world 2. All right, so now if I try to call myfunc2 before this variable is declared, this object is created, we're going to see a error. So if we do this, it'll say that myfunc2 is not a function because it is not yet declared. So whenever we create a function using this object creation notation, this syntax, we will always need to call the function after it has been created. So now you see it works. Okay, so this is what we have to know about functions and how JavaScript is going to understand how a function works. All right, so again, there's a few things that we have to know about a scope of a variable. There are a few ways to declare a variable. So earlier, I mentioned that a var is one way that we can declare a variable. Another way that we can declare a variable is using the let keyword. So the key difference between the two is that if we do a var I is equal to 10, or sorry, is equal to 0, and we cycle through all of these i's, I can do a console.log after, and I can actually output the I. Okay, so I can output what the I is afterwards. And right now, if we just do a refresh, you'll see that, well, it's hard to see, but this is where we outputted the I, right? So the I would have exited the loop when it was equal to 10. It wouldn't have logged the 10, but here is where we log the 10. Now, if we instead used the let, we will find that the 10 does not get displayed. Instead, it says I is not defined. And the reason is because the let is what we call blocked scoped. Okay, so a var is function scoped, right? So we define a var in here. It is part of this function that we have. Now, I know you don't see a function here, but you can imagine that the function is actually global at this stage, right? And the scope is this for loop. So if we do a let I, it means that I only exists within this for loop. So as soon as we exit out of that for loop, the I is no longer going to exist. Now the let is actually kind of useful because it allows us to be able to constrain our variable scope, and it allows us a little bit more secure usage of the variables. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to turn this back to var, and just going to make sure that this prints out the way that I want to. I'm going to also comment this out. All right, so one more thing that I want to talk about in terms of functions. Whenever we declare a function, oftentimes it is for the purposes of callback functions. So callback functions are very useful in the context of JavaScript. So what callback functions are is that there are certain functions in JavaScript, either that we can define on our own or that are predefined in JavaScript that will require us to write a callback function. So a good example of this is if I create a, actually, let's go over here and let's create an array, and I have a bunch of numbers in this array. All right, so I'm going to create a couple of numbers in this array, and there is this sort function in the array methods. So when I do an a.sort is going to allow me to sort the a. Okay, so if we take a look at what a is right now, it is actually sorted. Now, if you look closely, it's actually not really sorted, right? So we have the 1, we have 12, we have 19, and then 3, 34. So you can probably guess what's happening here is we are sorting, but JavaScript is actually looking at these numbers as if they were strings. And that actually makes a lot of sense for JavaScript, because a lot of times, even though JavaScript is working with numbers, it really is working with strings, because that is really the only way that we can interact with a web page. When we're putting something into a text box, for example, all of this is understood as a string, right? So it kind of makes sense that this is the sorting method that it's using. However, in our application, in this application, it's probably not what we want. So one thing we can do is we can actually define a function for the purposes of sorting. So we can actually create an unnamed function in JavaScript for the purposes of sorting. So what this sorting algorithm does, so if we do a.sort again, you'll notice that it says I'm going to want a compare function. Okay, so one way we can do this is actually to create a compare function and to be able to use that compare function in the context of sorting. So here, what we want to do is let's create a function for, we'll call it ascending. Okay, and what ascending does is it will take two variables, a and b, and it is going to return a minus b. All right, so the thing about sorting functions is that we want to be able to sort two numbers, or sorry, we want to be able to compare two numbers based on where they are in the order. So for a number a, which is larger than b, we want to be able to give a positive number. If b is larger than a, we want to give a negative number. And if they are equal, we want to give 0. And that's exactly what this function does. So I'm just going to save this, and I'm going to have an ascending function. So I'm going to start this again, and I'm going to, again, define this a, but this time I'm going to do a.sort, and I'm going to pass in this ascending function. Okay, so I'm going to pass this function as a parameter. And this is one example of a callback function, because this function is used in the context of another function. And that's really all callback is, right? So during some stage of a bigger function, I will need to use this function in order to make some calculations. So you see now, a actually gives me the correct order, and this is really the order that I want. All right, so let's do just one more example of callbacks. So actually here, I'm going to, again, comment out the functions, and let's do another example of a callback. So another function that is in JavaScript that's kind of useful is a set interval. Okay, so I can do a set interval, window.setInterval, and it is under the window object. And by the way, I hope you can see from our discussion before that we can invoke any of the internals, methods, or attributes of an object by doing a dot notation, right? So we can actually go several levels deep into an object just by doing the dot notation. So for window set interval, you'll notice that the first thing is a handler. Okay, so here I'm going to create a unnamed function, and this anonymous function is going to allow me to be able to create a callback to do something. So let's say I'm going to set the time interval, and the second parameter is how much time is going to be needed, but the first parameter is going to be a function. Okay, so now the function, notice here, I'm just defining a function, right? This notation is very similar to what I did here, right? So it's just like an object that I can create, right? And I'm passing in this function. So I'm going to do a console.log, and maybe I have a variable I, right, that I'm going to cycle through. So I'm just going to create a variable I here is equal to 0. And every time I go through this function, I'm going to increment I by 1, and I'm going to log I. Okay, so that's what it does every time it goes through this interval. Now the second parameter, so notice the first parameter is function. The second parameter is the timeout. So how much time do I want to give in between the intervals? So here I'm just going to say 2000, which is 2 seconds. Actually, let's do 1 second, because I don't want to wait too long. So I'm going to give 1 second between the intervals. And this function, again, is a callback function that I'm going to call every 1 second. All right, so if we run this and we see what happens, you'll see that it gets incremented, this I gets incremented, and it's going to be displayed every 1 second. All right, so because this thing is going to go on forever, I'm actually going to very quickly refresh this and not have this window interval. Although this is probably a good place to show you that for setting window intervals, we can actually set a var, I'll call it inter, right? So this variable is an object that is this interval. And when we run this, you notice that the thing keeps running. We can also do a window dot clear interval. And as long as we have the variable with us, we can clear the interval. And now we've stopped whatever it is that the callback is doing. Okay, so clearing the interval could be something that could be as a response to, for example, clicking a button. And I'll show you how to do that in 1 second. All right, so the last thing we'll say about functions in this section is earlier I mentioned that when we have a object, so when we create a person object, right, I can actually add a function to it. So one of the parameters in our person could be that I can add a function. So how we add a function is I can do, let's say, speak, right? So speak is our property, and I can define speak as a function, right? Now we could also have some parameters in there, right? Maybe I can say words, right? And what this, I can now define this function as doing something. So maybe this person, when they speak, I'm going to console.log words. Right, so I'm going to use this, whatever this is, and I'm just going to console log it. And that is how a person speaks. So in order to use this, I can, so I'm going to, again, comment this out. I can do person dot speak, and I can add some words in there. I can say hello, right, or whatever I want them to speak. I can be a little bit more elaborate with this speak function. And so if you take a look at what this looks like, it's just going to say hello, right? So this is invoked through person. You see, we have the object, dot, and then the method that's associated with it. So you can see how useful and how intuitive JavaScript is. Of course, we have to do a little bit of work to have a little bit of experience with JavaScript to see all of these things, but hopefully you find this intuitive. Now, one thing that I've actually left out is how do we interact with the web page? So we looked at all of these things pertaining to the function and everything like that, functions and objects and everything like that. But how do we actually grab parts of the web page and interact with it? Now, if you remember in CSS, one of the things we did in CSS was we grabbed elements and then we were able to change the properties of the elements. So in JavaScript, we can do the same thing. And how we do that is through this document object. So if we do document dot, there are several ways that we can grab elements from our page. So if we take a look at our boots.html file, you'll see that we have all of these things. We have classes here that we've defined, right? We have, we don't have an ID that we've defined, but we have all of these elements that we've defined as well, right? So there are many ways to get elements. So you notice that you can see get element by ID, get element by class name, or elements by class name, get elements by name, get elements by tag name, and so on, right? So all of these ways allow us to be able to get elements on our page. So I'm going to start by doing get element by ID, right? Now, just I guess before we do that, let's actually name an element. So I'm going to have, let's name this, let's see. Well, actually, I have an ID here called fname. So I can do get elements by ID, and I can say fname. Okay, so what this does is it's going to get me the text box, hopefully, that I've highlighted there, right? So notice that T refers to that text box, which I've labeled as fname, right? So this is the text box, right? The form control. And when I do this, now T represents that object, that text box. And if we do T dot, you'll see all of the things that we have. We can actually have access to all of these attributes, right? And in particular, one of the attributes we saw was value. Now what value is it allows us to be able to grab the value that's in that text box. Now currently it's nothing, but if we start typing something in there, right, we're going to be able to, again, do t.value, and we're going to be able to grab the value, we're going to be able to grab the value of that text box exactly at the moment that that web page is in. So you can see the dynamic nature of this, right? So grabbing, being able to grab certain parts of the web page is very important, and to be able to do other things with it. Now, not only that, we can also do t.value is equal to something, right? So we can assign it a value, and now you'll notice that the value is now equal to Steve, right? So we can dynamically assign values to each one of these things as well. Now, there are other ways that we can grab elements from our web page, right? So I'm going to do a var and C, and this time I'm going to do a document dot query selector, Okay, so there's a query selector and a query selector all. So I'm going to start with query selector, which is going to select the first of these elements. And for a query selector, what we do is we pass in a string that represents a CSS selector. So I want you to see here that there is a button and it has the value submit. It's kind of weirdly written here. So the way in CSS that we would grab this selector, and we didn't talk about this in the CSS tutorial, but we would do a input. So that we want to grab an input and we can identify that it has a value attribute equal to submit. And I have to type this out perfectly. So equal to submit, and this will grab this element C. So you notice that it actually grabs this submit button. Right? And again, we can do certain things with the submit button, and we can add values to it. So we can actually do .value, right? So notice the value is equal to submit right now, and we can change the value of this submit button. We can say this is a send instead, right? Maybe I think this is a better notation, right? So I change this to send instead. So one other way that we can grab elements, so if we do something like var td is equal to, and then document dot get elements by tag name, right? So notice that this is a plural, right? So get elements by tag name, and then we just grab the tags. So this is going to grab all of the TD tags from the HTML document. So if we take a look at what TD is right now, you'll notice that it's a bunch of TDs, right? So you'll notice that in the HTML file, we had a bunch of TDs, and I can now index them. So for example, I can say TD0, and this refers to the first of the TDs. So you can see that this is the tag that is the first of the TDs that I've grabbed, and you can index them accordingly as well. So be very careful about using grabbing the elements and to see what is, if it's a singular or if it's a plural. Okay, so that's really how we can grab elements from the page and work with them. So finally, let's talk about one of the more powerful things about JavaScript, which is giving some dynamic behavior based on user interaction. So if you take a look at what we have so far, we have this window with a form. So maybe one of the things I want to add to this is give it some dynamic behavior, such as whenever a user clicks on the window at any location, I want to process something. So for example, if I do something like window.add event listener, okay, so add event listener means that I want to add a listener to an event. Now, every time a user interacts with the web page, it triggers some sort of event. So there's a lot of different types of events, and the JavaScript reference is going to tell you what the events are. So there are events such as click, double click, left click, right click, key press. So there's a lot of different events that happen in JavaScript. So I'm just going to play around with two of them here. So one is key press. So let's say when this window hears a key press, I want to respond by invoking some function. Okay, so just so that we can see everything, I'm going to write a callback function, and this function is going to be called process key. Okay, so process key is going to be the callback function for this key press event. And anytime we have a callback function for an event, there's going to be an event variable. So there's going to be passed in a variable called e. Well, we can call it evt or whatever, but it's a variable that is passed into the function. And what this variable is going to tell me is it's an object representing everything about that event. So for example, if I do a evt, well, actually, let's just do a console.log the EBT at this point, and I just want to see what this event looks like. So what I can do is add the process key into the callback of this window add event listener. So essentially what these two lines are doing is every time I hear a key press on the window, then I'm going to run this process key function. So it's going to console.log this event. Okay, so let's see if this works. So I'm going to run this, and now every time I'm on the window and I press a key, notice that this event pops up, or this event object pops up. So right now I just pressed the T key. So you'll notice that one of the things that is in this object is the key attribute, right? So the key attribute tells me that I pressed T, right? So I'm going to come press it again. I'm going to press the G this time, and it tells me that I pressed the G key. So every time something is pressed on the window, it is triggered, right? So this window add event listener says this whole window, anywhere on this window where I'm interacting, if I press this key, it's going to trigger this event. Now you can probably imagine that I can narrow the scope of this event listener by adding an event listener to, let's say, this text box, right? And meaning that when I'm typing something into this text box, I can again add an event listener for key press, and then maybe I can do something there as well. But ultimately, one thing that we can do is we can give this, use this function in some way. So for example, instead of console.logging the EVT, the event object itself, maybe I'm going to just log the key. So I'm going to refresh this page, and now when I press it, you'll see that what gets console logged is actually the button that I'm pressing on the keyboard. Right? So this is actually very useful, because now anytime I press a key while in the window, I can actually determine which key it is. So I can say, for example, if the event.key is equal to W, then I'm going to say that if I'm implementing a game, I can say my character is going forward, right? Or if it's S, then my character is going backwards. And then we can write the rest of the code to respond to that event going off. All right, so that's the key press event, and I highly recommend that you play around with it and just try to do some interesting things with it. All right, so let's do one more thing here. For example, let's grab an element. So we'll do var, and we'll call it button. All right, so the button is this thing right here, and I want to grab that submit button. And earlier we did something like document.getElement, not by ID, but by query selector. So let's do a query selector. Okay, now query selector, you'll notice that there's also a query selector all. So query selector all means that I'm going to provide a CSS selector, but it's going to give me an array or a collection of these elements that are grabbed. But query selector only grabs the first such element. Okay, so if my intent is to only grab one element, then we're going to be using query selector. All right, so earlier we did something like input, and then from the input, if it has the value equal to submit, it looks like this, then I'm going to grab that element. So now this element is referred to as button. And now I'm going to do button.add event listener. And this time I want to listen not for a key press, but I want to listen for a click. So when I click on this button, right? So when I reach the event that I click on this button, I want to run a function. So again, I could actually define a function in this way and just pass it in as a parameter, but instead here I'm going to give it an anonymous function. So I'm going to say this is a function, and again I have an event variable that is passed in, and now this is what I'm going to do with this button when I press it. The first thing I'm going to do is take this event and I'm going to prevent the default. All right, when we prevent the default, remember very early in this video, I said when I press on this submit button, what it wants to do is submit all of the data that's associated with this form to the back end. So preventing the default is going to prevent it from doing that, right? So it's going to say, I don't want you to send this data anywhere. I want you actually to do nothing. And so this now is me going to define what I want this function to do. All right, so maybe when I click this button, I'm going to grab this element here. Okay, so this element is the text box. So if we go back and take a look at what that text box actually is, it's the IDF name. Okay, so I'm going to come back over here and do a document dot get element by ID this time, and it is called fname. So I'm going to go to that box fname, and I'm going to grab that element. Okay, and then I'm going to do dot value. Okay, so I'm going to take the value associated with that element. All right, so just to make sure that this is actually giving me something, I'm just going to come over here and take a look at what this actually gives me. So right now it gives me nothing, but if I type something in here, then this is going to give me the value that's inside. So that's great. This is, I'm grabbing the value, and let's put a var, make this var equal to, we'll call it text is equal to this. So now I'm going to take the text, and what I'm going to do now is finally, maybe I take this text, and when I click on this button, I'm going to change this registration. Right? I'm going to change this registration into whatever the text is saying. So let's take a look at where that registration is. This is the legend. Okay, so I'm going to then do document.get elements by tag name, and I'm going to get the tag name legend. Now notice that this is elements by tag name. So what running this this command is going to give me a collection. I'm going to take the 0th index of the legend because I know that there's only one legend in my whole file. And then I'm going to do dot value. Now again, I just want to double check that this is actually giving me the right thing. So if I do, it doesn't look like it's giving me the right thing. So no, it's dot inner HTML. There we go. So inner HTML is the registration. So I'm going to do dot inner HTML is equal to my text. All right, so essentially what I'm doing here is when I click on this button, so I've grabbed the button first of all, and when I click on this button, this function is going to fire. And this function is going to first prevent the default of this event happening. Then it's going to grab the text of the element called fName, the value of the element fName, and then it's going to grab the elements by tag name called legend, the first value, the 0th index, and then the inner HTML I want to replace with the text. Okay, so hopefully what we're going to see when we click on this submit is we're going to grab whatever's in this text box and we're going to replace it into there. So just so that we don't see anything annoying, I'm going to actually comment those 3 things out, and this is all that's going to be running. So right now I'm going to restart this. So I'm going to refresh this page, and I'm going to see that now it's refreshed. I'm going to type something into this first name, hello, and if I hit submit, you'll notice that this registration now becomes hello, right? So this is dynamic, and hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. Any element, any event that happens on this web page, you will be able to attach an event listener to it, and you'll be able to apply some action to it. So not only can we just grab values from a text box or anything like that, we'll also be able to do calculations or cause another element to display some data and so on. So you can imagine all the things that we can do just from the browser's point of view. All right, so that's all for this tutorial. I will see everybody in the next video.